So to begin the simulation, we're going to drop in a cylinder, and we're going to go to caps, and we're going to turn off the caps. And I'm going to go to the object. I'm going to set the radius for now to about 250. I'm going to set the height to about 100. We're going to take the height segments, we're going to bring them down to 2. I'm going to take the rotation segments up to about 150. So if we do N and B here to go to garage shading, what we're going to see is we've got this nice ring, and we're going to clone this and then start putting some modifiers on it, some simulation modifiers to pull these together. So I'm going to turn off my work plane, then I'm going to drop this in a cloner. And we're just going to change this cloner to linear, and we're going to turn off the Y. So we've got 50 centimeters in the Y, we're going to zero that out. I'm going to bring up the count for now to about 15, and nothing is happening right now. So what we want to do is create some rings. So what we're going to do is select the cloner, go to MoGraph, Effector, and Step Effector. And you can see now that we have these rings. So I'm going to push these slightly closer together. So let's drop a cloth tag on the cloner, and we'll do Control D. We'll come to Simulation, we'll go to the gravity, we'll turn off the gravity. What we're going to do to start pulling these together is we're going to go to Simulate Forces, and we're going to add in a field force. Now I'm going to set the strength to about 250 for now, and we're going to drop in a spherical field. I'm going to turn off the spherical field in the viewport, and I'm going to make the spherical field, well, I'm going to turn off the field force, sorry. I'm going to make the, just because I don't like these lines, a little bit annoying to look at. I'm going to make this, if we come to the top view here, we're going to make it a little bit bigger than the rings themselves, and we're going to, I found that what works best is kind of setting the inner offset kind of similar to where the inside ring is. So if we press F1 again and we come back to this main view, I'm going to set the time here to about 600 frames because I'm going to cache quite a few, so I've got room when I'm retiming this to speed it up and slow it down with a lot of room left over. If we hit play now, these are going to pull in really, really aggressively. And you can see that the effect's already happening, but we need to make a few tweaks to this to get it to look the way we want. Because if I'm to drop in a subdivision surface here and a cloth surface, I'm holding Alt while I do that to set them as parents. So we set this to 0.5. And I play through this again. We have a little look at this. For one, it's moving in really quick. But what I don't like, now again, this is personal preference, you might like this. I don't like these kind of tight lines. And this is being caused by a couple of things. There's a couple of ways we can get around this by changing the rotation segments or changing the bendiness inside the cloth. But the most effective way to get around it, if we want more kind of purlin type patterns, is to mess with the speed of the field force, because a lot of this is being caused by the aggressiveness it's being pulled in by. So let's have a little look at this again and see how we can make this more artistic. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in a turbulence, and I'm going to set this to a strength of about 10 and a scale of about, maybe a bit higher, 15 and a scale of about 10. We'll come to the fields, we'll drop in just a cylinder field here, and we're going to scale it down. The scale doesn't really matter. If we come to the top view here and we select that, I'm going to set this about in the middle of the clones, somewhere in the middle, so as they're getting pulled in, they start being affected by the turbulence. So if I turn off the field force here, you'll see that those ones on the inside are getting loosened up by the turbulence, and that's going to give us just a little bit more variation. So then we can play this, and there's a bit of turbulence going on now, which is just giving a slightly different effect. What I'm going to do is start naming everything. So we're not totally done yet with setting up the objects themselves. So I'm going to name this step effector to radius. This step effector is just going to be our radius for the most part, and that's going to be how we're controlling the amount of clones and the distance of them. I'm going to go to the cloner, I'm going to grab another step effector. I'm going to drag this down here, we're going to call this scale. And inside this one, we're going to turn off uniform scale, and we're going to mess with the Y here. But I want it to scale down from the inside, not the outside. So we're going to invert that here. Just like that. And now we're scaling down from the inside. So I want the ones on the inside to be smaller, and that's going to make them be affected by the forces easier, which is going to pull everything in slightly quicker. And what that's also going to do is create a very nice effect where when we're pulling in here, we're going to kind of get them scaling away at the top, which is going to be very, very nice. I'm going to drop in one more effector, and that's going to be a random. And I guess we can call this, it's random, so we can probably leave it as random. We're just going to turn off the position, go to the scale, go to the Y, come back to the beginning. I'm just going to mess with the, ever so slightly, the scale of the Y here, just to give them some variation. And again, that's going to help just with the complexity of the simulation and making it look more artistic and better. I do just want to take a little break from the tutorial for 30 seconds or so to tell you about my Patreon, and also to let you know that there's going to be a more advanced version of this tutorial over on the Patreon, where we're going over the scenes I've already made and the kind of complexities around that, and implementing colliders and how we can get even cooler results by messing with the modifiers. So if you're interested in that, definitely go check that out. Also, all the project files from all the scenes I made in this tutorial are going to be over there, including the Octane one and the Redshift one and all the different R&D files. So if you want to go and have a look at them and break them apart, they'll also be under the same post in the same tutorial over there. Without further ado, I will let you get back to making these cool cloth rings. But now let's work on art directing this and getting something that looks a little bit cooler. Like I said, I'm not keen on these really, really tight formation patterns. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways around that and how we can change that. So, for example, if we were to drop the rotation segments by half to about 75, we're going to get less folds. That's quite evident, really. And that's one way to affect this. But there's still kind of a lot of tightness there, and then we're just kind of getting gaps. It's going to be one way around it. Another way, if we're to bring that back up, can be to drop the bendiness. So we can drop the bendiness. And that's certainly a nice way to do it. But there's still a lot of these tight patterns, which I don't like. So what I mentioned before, that is mostly coming down to the power that they're being dragged in by. I'm going to tell this field force to consider the mass, and I'm going to bring up the strength to about 500. I'm going to make the field force a little bit bigger, and it's going to go a lot slower, but when they get pulled in, and this is the good thing about having 600, 600 frames, we might even have to go up to 900. The patterns themselves are going to look more artistic and a little bit more pleasing, and a little bit cooler. But now we need to work on this to kind of get a similar effect to what we had before. So what this is just going to take is tweaking various values and kind of getting this where we want it to be. So first thing I'm going to do is Control D. I'm going to go to Simulation. You can actually fix this quite easily just by adding in another iteration. That's going to help with the folds a little bit and compensate. As you can see there, they're all folding in really neatly now. And then let's bring down the substeps as well to about 10. And let's bring up the collision passes to 3, maybe 2 extra iterations. And we can see the effect there is minimal, but it's progress. And then in the field force, let's actually make it even bigger. And I'm going to spread out the radius a little bit more. Again, similar effect, but now the field force is a lot weaker. Let's actually crank up the bendiness. So let's crank up to about 50. Let's see what happens. And you can see now we're getting very similar effects as to what I'm after. Again, there's still a lot of tight folds, which I'm not super keen on. And I'm not super keen on the amount of variation. I do want it a little bit neater. So again, this is just the nature of simulations, really, isn't it? It is. Let's bring this down to about 0.1. And in terms of the scale as well, we can maybe bring that up a little bit. Maybe drop the height to about 80 for now. Increase the radius a little bit too. Let's give it some more rotation segments, but 200. Again, we may drop that. And this is what I like as well. I like the exterior ones kind of lacking behind and taking a while to catch up. I've got a pretty cool effect there. But it still needs a little bit of tweaking. So let's go to the cloner. Let's add more clones. So let's maybe come up to 25. What we're going to have to do now is spread these out a little bit as well. So let's spread them out a little bit. And then let's compensate by bringing up the radius of the turbulent cylinder field. I'm going to bring up the inner offset a little bit. I'm going to make this a little bit larger again. I'm going to hit play there. Let's turn on the subdivision on the cloth surface. And now we've got some pretty cool patterns going on. So if I was to set the composition here to 1080 by 1920 and go for Instagram type composition, just Shift V will tighten up the opacity of the safe frames. Just drop in a camera, set it to 135. You can see there very similar effects to what I was showing. And at this point, it's just going to take various tweaking to get this where we want it to be. So what I'm going to do is play with this a little bit and go more into kind of a tweaking phase where everything's a little bit less neat, and I'm just going to be shifting this back and forth to get it exactly how I want it to be. So I want these to be, again, I want less height variation, and we're going to try and get some nicer patterns than this. Again, like I said, I don't like how squiggly it is. I want it a little bit looser. So, you know, let's drop the rotation segments to about 120. We'll have a little look at that. And to be honest, the cylinder field is probably a bit too big now, because if you give it too much turbulence on the way in, that can be encouraging a lot of the variation outside of the random scale as well. So at least a lot of the variation on the height. Whereas I do want a very neat kind of scale going outwards. And this is a little bit nicer. As we can see, that's more of what I'm after. More of these kind of long curling patterns. I think that looks a little bit more pleasing. I'm a big fan of that. But I don't want so many gaps between them. We'll probably get around that just by decreasing the radius a little bit. And you see here we're running out of frames really, so let's do 900. This is quite a light simulation. It's going to cache really quickly, so we can kind of afford to export this number of frames in terms of being able to retime it and condense it down to about 7 to 10 seconds. So we can see now. Let's turn them on. Let's jump back in here. We have something pretty cool going on. I'm going to reduce the thickness. Again, you might like the amount of variation, but I like the simplicity of this. This is very much the effect that I like. These long curling patterns looks really cool. And this is something I'm pretty happy with. This is generally the basis of the effect and the look in the simulation itself. There's not really anything else here that I've been messing with to change or get different results. I did try with a rotation in the middle, and that's cool. There's definitely different things you can add in. But for the most part, this was how I create the effect, was just using this setup with the radius, the scale, and the random. And then these two force modifiers. There's not a whole lot else to it. And what I'm going to do now is make a couple of more final tweaks before I go over some different retiming methods. And we're going to set up some colors as well before we move into Octane. And then I'll show you a little bit of look dev in Redshift as well. But for now, I'm just going to make a couple of final tweaks. So right now, I'm relatively happy with this, although I wouldn't mind a couple of more pattern formations and having it a little bit looser. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with this. So let's try with the bendiness of 100. And let's see how this looks. Now, hopefully this should just give me a couple of more bends, a couple of more kind of pattern variations going on. here so it's not, you know, so uniform. And that's more what I want. I like that a lot. So let's turn on that subdivision, let's turn on that cloth surface. And this is really nice because, you know, we have the kind of richness. I'm going to turn off my axis here. We have the richness in the middle, and then, although I don't like that really sharp bit, but either way, I'm not going to spend too much time, you know, taking out these bugs and completing it, you know, for the sake of the tutorial. But we have these big kind of looser shapes on the outside, whereas it's a bit more squiggly in the middle, and that's the general kind of effect that I like here. So what we're going to do now is we're going to set up some color. I'm going to leave most of the simulation here. I think you kind of understand now of what you need to tweak and change to get different effects. Add more clones, you know, mess with the bendiness, mess with the radius, the rotation segments, and the kind of scale of the field force as well will definitely help. You know, maybe before I take this any farther, I will just add a couple of more clones. Let's increase the radius a little bit, just so they're not too close together. And then let's just increase that a little bit. I think the largest I went to was about 50. And you can see it's pretty slow. And those ones on the outside aren't really getting pulled in enough. We can maybe bring back the turbulence a little bit now. Let's maybe set this back to 10. Let's play through this. Just going to decrease the radius a little bit again. Okay, this is more of what I'm after. So, you know, we've got the very loose ones on the outside, and it's kind of building up. Although it would be nicer to have just a bit more scale there. So let's just make that a little bit more aggressive. I'm probably actually just going to bring these back down a little bit. I don't really want that many for the tutorial at least. And let's see this. Now we're going to have them pulling in quicker because they're smaller, and we're going to have even more of that scale variation towards the outside, which I think certainly makes the compositions a little bit easier to work with as well. Something like that. Although it's kind of pushing too tight too quickly. So, you know, a way around that is let's reduce that inner offset there. Because then we reduce that and we're not going to have all of them pulling in so much. Because you don't, you know, the bigger this spherical field, the more they're all going to be pulled in by the exact same kind of units of force. So we scale that down and we're going to get more variation in the strength by which they're being pulled in. Which, when it comes to setting up the camera, just means it's going to look a little bit nicer, a little bit looser. You're going to get those kind of loose patterns up the back, and that looks nice. I'm going to save that. Let's come out the camera. What we're going to do is we're going to set up some colors. So there's a couple of different retiming methods here that I wanted to go over. I'm going to go over it more in the tutorial over on Patreon. There's going to be kind of more advanced utilities of using this and going over some different kind of complexities with it, but I'm still going to go over setting up the color here and some different retiming methods. So the retiming methods you're generally used to are going to be an alembic retime, where we're going to cache this and then take out the cloner as an alembic and bring that back in to use the alembic retime to retime it. But if we are to set up the color the way I'm about to show you with a random effector, what we're going to have to do is use a fracture to bring that color back in. And then if we want to use that with the alembic, we're going to have to export the full alembic with the cloth surface, with the subdivision, and it's going to be about 50 gigabyte, and it's going to be very big and very heavy. And we're going to have to use an attribute texture, whereas if we retime with the second method that I'm about to show you, we can get away without an alembic retime. Although the retiming is less flexible, it's going to make it easier to use color variation. If you don't want to use random color variation, use the alembic retime. If you do want to use random color variation, do the method I'm about to show you. So we're going to drop in a random here, and we're going to rename this CD, that stands for color. That is the color attribute kind of across different 3D software. We're going to turn off the position. We don't want this to do anything. We don't want the random to do anything. We're putting in this random to pull color attributes from it, and that's going to be random color attributes. So if we set the color mode to effector color, what we're just basically doing is taking that random effector and we're just pulling random color distributions from it, and that's what we're going to use it for. But as you can see, when we turn on the subdivision, we turn on the cloth surface, what happens? We lose the color. So what we want to do is reinstate that attribute, and we're going to do that by dropping it in a fracture. We're going to set this to, we can keep it on straight. Do we want it on straight? Pretty sure we want to, I think we can keep it on straight. I'll find out in a minute. We're going to drop in this random color here, set it to, we do want it in explode segments, yeah. So explode segments, we're going to drop in that CD there. And then now when we play through this, you're going to see here that we're able to retain that color attribute throughout the subdivision, the cloth surface, which is going to be super useful for art direction. So just turn that on there. You can see we have these random colors now, which looks really, really cool. I'm going to turn down that turbulence a little bit. Again, I'm not super happy with it, so I'm about 3 and about 5 there. I'm going to turn that down. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cache the simulation, and I'm going to show you this first method of retiming, and then of course I'll just go over the alembic again. I've done it in previous tutorials and a lot of other people have, but I'll still go over it. In fact, before we cache it, we need to do something else first. So the way to retime this is going to be pre-cache. We're going to do Control D, we're going to go to the scene, and we're going to mess with the timescale. If you mess with the timescale, because it's pre-cache, if we're going to mess with this right now, we're going to mess with the simulation itself and the way it looks. So what I'm going to do is keep this at scale of 1 for now, but I'm going to keyframe it. I'm going to play through here to when they connect. In fact, we can speed this up a little bit. So let's double the speed. Let's set the timescale to 2. Now it's going to go twice as fast, so we're going to get them connecting quicker. It is going to mess with the simulation a little bit, but not so much until we get up to about 10, 15. I'm just going to make sure that this still looks good, because the faster it is, the less time it's going to have to calculate. Still happy with that. That still looks good. I can maybe just begin on 1.5 actually, just so I'm not losing too much. And then we'll play through. So controlling the time and the retime before caching is a little bit difficult, but this does cache quite quickly, so it makes it easy to go back. And what I was thinking about doing here was actually just popping in another keyframe further in and then making it go really slow, and then when we cache, offsetting the start of it. But I think I'm actually going to go back on that. Let's come up to about 10 here. Let's play through to about 20 frames in. Maybe 30. 35. Let's set another keyframe. I'm going to turn off the cloner for a second just because I kind of know what's going to happen. I'm going to come through up to about 50. I'm going to set this to about, well, I'll bring it back to 1 basically. So what we can see here is if we go to the dope sheet and we press H here, we can see the keyframes. So we've got it at a value of 10. You can see here, we're moving through after about frame 35 where they connect. It's going to drop down over the next 20 frames back to a speed of 1. So let's play through that. It's going to get a little bit laggy because it's calculating so fast. But once the speed drops back down, it's going to get smooth again. And we can see there we've got a retime without an alembic and without caching. But we are losing some cool parts of the simulation. We can kind of get some of that back by coming to the simulation, bring down the substeps even more. And then let's mess with the field force, make it a little bit bigger just so parts aren't being left out. And that's more like it. So now we have a retime. I can view this here. I'm just going to turn off the color for a second. But I just want that to be a little bit sharper once it connects. So let's come back to the dope sheet and let's just bring this closer. So it's just going to slow down quicker now. They're going to slam together and they're going to slow down nearly instantly. But that's a little bit off. So what we've got here, they're connecting here. So we need to bring that down to frame 26. And we want them to slow down there up to about frame 30. So let's play this again. Now that should be a bit more accurate. And they're slowing down. So that's more of a effective retime where they're pulling in really quickly, and as soon as they connect, they slow down. So let's do that with the subdivision, although it'll be a little bit laggy. Boom. Now let's cache this. And we didn't really need to cache 900 frames because after, you know, a couple of hundred frames, it's just kind of fluttering about. So, you know, you probably only really need to cache about 600. I think it's useful to have the extra room here, especially if you're Alembic retiming, because then you can kind of utilize more frames ahead of time. But I'm going to bring this down to about 300 now. And you can see we've got that speed of it slamming in. I would usually make this a little bit nicer. Although I have made a mistake. I just cached this without the color on. So I'm going to have to redo that quickly. But that's quite nice. So I'm going to redo that. I'm probably only going to cache 600 this time. And of course, it's a bit of a different workflow and a little bit more destructive in terms of retiming than an Alembic retime, because with an Alembic retime, you can just kind of keep changing it and everything's already set in place. And if we want to change the speed, we have to clear the cache, and then we have to go back to the dope sheet and we have to change things. I mean, I think I'm actually just going to push that like a couple of frames later anyway. And I think I'm actually going to have this decrease in its speed to about 7, just so it's not so sudden. More like that, a little bit softer. Turn back on that color data, and I'm going to cache 600 frames. Okay, cool. So that's it cached, and it's retimed already. And it's certainly a little bit less heavy than Alembics. So I'm going to save this incrementally. Control-Alt-S. You can see we put on the subdivision, put on the cloth surface, bring back in with the fracture, and the color comes back. So that's about it for retiming method number 1. What I'm going to do now is I am going to show you just the Alembic retime again. I'm going to go back to an older version of the scene, and then we're going to work with this for the Octane look dev. And then I'll show you some Redshift look dev as well. So we're back in a slightly older version of the scene here. And what we're going to do is do an Alembic retime. I'm going to show you this method now. So we're in a version of the scene before any of the messing with the time scale or anything. I'm just going to bring up the scale of the spherical field a little bit and make this a little bit more powerful just for the sake of this. And then I'm going to make sure that yep, everything seems good. And I'm probably going to have to cache 900 for the Alembic, because we're not even hitting a connection until 10 seconds in. So 900 seems like enough. So I'm just going to cache the cloth first. And then once the cloth itself is cached, we scrub through that here. And I'm not going to show you this with the color data, because like I said, I'll show that over on Patreon a little bit more. But we're going to have to, we would have had to, in terms of the Alembic, take the subdivision, the cloth surface, and the fracture. It's going to be very, very slow. And I think it's just worth doing the other method to get the color. So what we do now is just select the cloner, file, export, Alembic, make sure you hit the little gear there, and we're going to make sure that merge generated is on. That's crucial. See a lot of comments in previous tutorials where people haven't selected this and then it's coming in multiple different objects and whatnot. So we need merge generated on. We're going to export that, and we call this, you know, Alembic _001, and then wait for that. And then you would want to come into a new scene here and go to File, Merge, and drop in the Alembic. And then you're going to have to reinstate the subdivision and the cloth surface. Again, set that to about 0.5. And if we set this to about 300 frames, we have our cloth simulation, but we want to retime that. So we would go to time remapping here inside the Alembic, and you want to select both these points, right click, spline presets, or point type, sorry, and soft. And then, you know, you can put other points in here and speed this up really, really quickly, and then bring back down the endpoint. So for example, boom, it's going to come in really, really quickly. And of course, this is a better way of retiming. You've got more control in real time. You can see what's going on better. Maybe lift that up a little bit. A little bit more. Just make that a little bit quicker at the beginning. Even quicker. You can even have it start a couple of frames too soon, and then, but we want that to slow down more still. you kind of want it to slow down on that first connection, really. So as soon as it hits in the middle, I want it to do it sooner, and something like that. And that's a method of alembic retiming. But what we're going to do now is go back to the other version where we retimed it with the time scale, and we're going to work with that in Octane, and then I'll show you some similar stuff in Redshift. So what we're going to do now is do some Octane look dev. This is going to be quite similar to the last two cloth tutorials that I've done, but of course this time we're going to be messing with the colors a little bit, so there's a bit more to discover there. We're going to lock the live viewer, get it running, switch to path tracing, and we're just going to play. I'm going to pause it while I play through it, and we'll come to about here, a little bit longer, and we'll turn on that cloth surface. And first thing, I'm going to drop in a texture environment. I'm going to make it black, and then I'm going to call that shadow, and duplicate it, call it BG, and we'll make this one white, but we'll set that one to visible environment. And then I'm going to press F2, cameras, perspective. I'm going to press N, then A, and I'm going to turn off both the environments in the viewport, turn off my work plane, turn off my axis, just so I'm working in a nice clean viewport. And the first thing I'm going to do is drop in a area light. Now we can get away with just using one light here. I would suggest using just one light because it's going to reduce noise. This is going to be a heavy render in itself. So we're just going to use one light. We're going to put a target on it, and we'll just target any object really in the kind of object tree that's part of this cloner setup. And then I'm going to add a Octane camera tag, enable the camera imager, and I'm going to enable ACES tone mapping. I'm going to bring up the exposure. So cool looking render already. Let's drop in a specular material, and then let's open the node editor. Let's apply that specular material to the cloth surface. And then in here, I'm going to give the roughness about 0.7. I'm going to give the reflection about 0.5. We're going to go to common. I'm going to turn on fixed shadows. And we're going to drop in a random walk medium. Plug it into the medium. We're going to grab a RGB spectrum. Plug it into the albedo, plug the same one into the transmission. Let's make it a slightly nice color. And that's kind of the materials I've been using. So you may recognize these from my reels. Now I want to go over a couple of different color methods here. So the material setup, the lights are set up, looks really good. Camera setup, very simple, only takes a couple of minutes really. Add some vignetting there. Bump up the saturation a little bit. Can maybe make the light like a little bit thinner and a little bit taller. If we look at the direction of the camera here, I think having it somewhere on the side looks good. We can have it a little bit closer too. And then with the camera, something like this. Let's mess with the blue as well, because I like making them blue. It's very reminiscent of like Windows when you make them blue. Like I mentioned, a couple of different color methods. One thing I was doing is putting gradients on them, and you can do this with a field texture. If you grab a spherical field from the field texture, we put transform and a projection on that. Gonna save here, and then we put that into a gradient. So we'll grab a gradient here, and then we'll put that gradient. I'm just gonna unplug that texture projection because it seems to be making things a little bit laggy. I'm not sure why. Anyway, put that gradient on there, and you can see we have a gradient now. So let's make it, for example, blue on the outside and pink in the middle. And if you go to that transform and you just bump up the scale, you've got this like lovely gradient from like one color to another. And you can change the fall off radius. You can change the core radius too. And that kind of inhibits you from having to use the scale as much if you're changing that core radius, but you definitely want a decent amount of fall off there. You can actually bump that way up, so you can set that fall off radius to about 2 or 3 even. Let's maybe reduce the saturation of these colors a little bit. Maybe not that much. But you can get a gradient doing that. So that's quite a cool way. It's not stuck to the texture, it's not stuck to the object, but you don't really notice it because of the speed of the simulation. So you can add gradients doing stuff like that. Well, that color is very, very hot. I don't know if you want it that crazy. Something like that's a little bit nicer. A little bit cleaner. So, you know, let's, call that gradient. Gradient. Now, all these project files will be on my Patreon, so if you want to go and check them all out, check out the textures that I'm making here, go over there, have a little look. Might ease it up a little bit if you're struggling. We'll call this one multi. So I'm duplicating that material, I'm calling it multi. Let's pop that on the cloth surface, but what I'm actually going to do now is turn on the fracture and drag it up to the fracture. So we can delete the field texture. We can delete these RGB spectrums. We're going to keep the gradient just for a second. Now I did wonderfully just manage to crash the software, but we are back. I'm going to try this again, delete this here. It's definitely good to be in the habit of pausing the live viewer when you're maybe deleting nodes out of the node editor and stuff. Sometimes with stuff that's quite heavy like this. But anyway, we're back. So what we can do, let's keep this gradient. I'm going to press tab and I'm going to drop in a color shader. So a MoGraph color shader. Now this will just use the attribute from the random without us having to do anything. And we can plug this into the albedo and into the transmission. And you can see we're getting those random colors. They're there. So let's put this into the gradient. And then have the gradient going into both the transmission and the albedo. Now let's make this, for example, white and green. So we'll make this one white. We'll make this one green. And you can see there, we're able to use multiple colors. And then we can have a darker green here. Maybe not darker, maybe just like a different tint more towards yellow. And if we drag this out here, let's tighten this up. We don't really want them to be blending too much. We can bring back in the white again. Then we can take the green again. Make sure they're staying nice and tight. We could get a more kind of aquatic green there. Then bring back in the white again. Just like that. We have all these lovely multicolors going on. You can even add a bit more dimension as in these white ones. Just bring in a little bit of color. No, I think I'm going to do an Xbox one next, which is what's inspiring me to do this. And, you know, this is where, you know, using Ace's tone mapping can be quite important here, because we can kind of really overly push that saturation and get something looking really, really lovely. And, you know, let's map out the exposure a little bit. What that Octane light? Mess with the lighting ever so slightly. Let's bring it down a little bit. We can see now we've got lots of different colors going on and it looks really nice. Let's try a slightly different camera angle. Let's try something like 300. Zoom out at a distance. Turn the camera. Have a look at what's going on here. It looks nice. So of course you can use so many different colors here. Do whatever you want to do with it. Looks pretty cool. Let's let this render out for a second. Now I do think you want to get quite deliberate with the colors, you know. I mean, this isn't something I would be happy with personally. I would usually duplicate the gradient and then come back. So maybe we could start off with the green in the middle. Tighten these up a little bit more. And I think you probably want to desaturate the colors a bit more on a whole. That tends to work better with these, like random walk materials and specular materials. It's more because of the transmission. Is when you're plugging into the transmission, you do want to be desaturating the colors. Otherwise, you're going to get quite a nasty look. So, keep them quite light. And that looks great. Try a couple of different things there. Let's try some different colors entirely. Let's do like blue and pink, just like we did before. Again, like I said, just don't make that mistake I did. Don't make them too dark. Let's make a pink one. Again with the blue. I think we can probably get away with duplicating this. And we've got the whites in there too. That looks pretty cool. Let's bring off the saturation a little bit in the imager. And lighten up the blues, for example. So, there's a little bit purple right now. And bring back up that saturation. I'm just going to pause that, turn them off, play through a little bit more, turn them back on. Because I don't like this bend here. That's kind of something I probably should have, or if I was making a full render of this, I would go back and kink out and get rid of, but I'm not going to spend time in it during the tutorial. Lots of cool stuff here. Lots of cool effects and looks. One thing you're probably going to want to do though is, I should have done this to begin with, is turn down the density to about 50. Maybe even 25. That's going to lighten the colors up a lot as well. So of course I was sitting there reducing the saturation of all the colors when the density is kind of playing a big part there too. So I should have remembered to do that at the beginning. So maybe now with that density turned down, we can have a little look at the green one again. And that looks a little bit cooler now, doesn't it? Bring back down that saturation. And that's looking quite a bit nicer. Okay, so that's about it for Octane. So that's kind of the workflow around Octane. We'll call this random color. I will mention over on my Patreon about if we were to do this with the Alembic using an attribute texture. But this is really all you need to know regarding Octane render settings with these. I would do about 248. I was actually rendering these in 1024. I was rendering them in 1280 or 720 by 1280 and running a denoiser on it with about 0.2 in the blend. Turn on that denoiser. So enable denoise beauty, main use denoise beauty pass. And then what I was doing was using Topaz Video AI to scale it up, because even you can see here on just 1,000 samples with 33080s, I'm running about 90 seconds to 2 minutes a frame. So that's quite a long render. So 1080p is double that amount of time. Definitely suggest purchasing Topaz AI if you haven't got it. It really speeds up your renders a lot and allows you to render in low resolution and upscale. I've been doing it for a long time now, so probably about 6 months or so. So it's definitely something useful to do. With that being said, that's Octane. Now let's do some similar stuff in Redshift. The reel I just played was one of these kind of dynamic cloth simulations that I did, and I did it in Redshift. So we're going to create a similar setup. We are in the version of the scene before I did any look dev in Octane, so we're going to do the same thing in Redshift. It's going to be really easy to set up, and we're going to get going with that. Very similar setup, just the Redshift version of it, I suppose. So let's switch to Redshift. So first things first, let's grab that Redshift render view and let's get this going. Awesome. So again, it's going to be a very, very similar setup to what we just did. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in a material and I'm going to put that on the fracture. And then let's grab a Redshift camera and I'm going to come into the camera and I'm going to set it to about 300. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. We'll go with something like this. And then I'm going to add a dome light. This is just going to be our background. So I'm going to maybe set it to like a light blue or something. Maybe like a bluish kind of gray. We're going to come to the details and I'm going to zero out everything because we just want it to be our background. So we zero everything, just becomes a background. And then we go to Redshift again and we'll add in an area light. We'll do the same as Octane, right click, animation tags, target. We will target that fracture. We'll press F2. I'm going to turn off the dome light just like we do with the environments in Octane, just so it's not in the viewport. And I'm going to push this light all the way up here. I'm going to make it a bit thinner, a bit taller. Push it off to the side. Get some nice lighting there. Again, we see where the Redshift camera is coming from. And then put the light facing appropriately. So let's do something like this, a bit wider, a bit bigger. Cool. Happy with that. So regarding the material, if we come into the node editor, I like the newer version of the node editor in Redshift, so you'll probably only ever see me using that. And the first thing we're going to do is drop in a color. So we're going to just drop in a color node there, plug it into the color, and then very similar to Octane, just set the roughness to about 0.7. We'll scroll down to subsurface and we're going to control click on the color and the radius, and we're going to plug this color node into the color, into the radius, and we'll make it blue. And we can get a bit deeper with the colors in Redshift, it's not as sensitive as Octane. And then in the subsurface, set the weight to about 0.6 or about 0.8. We'll set the scale to about 0.5. I'm going to make that a little bit of a richer blue. Something like this. Awesome, that was good. Just going to mess with the light a little bit more. And then I've got these settings up here. So if you go to View, Settings, pull up these settings. I like to just color correct in here really. So I like to kind of override everything and do all my color corrections in here. So if we turn this on and, you know, give it some curves, give it a little bit of punch here, and then just kind of whack away some of those highlights as well. Get something cool there. You can add in a bit of bloom, bring down the threshold. And then in the camera, I'll go to, where is it? Tone mapping. We'll turn on tone mapping. And that's a pretty cool look. Very similar to what we just had in Octane, just like that. Oh, I don't want a crazy amount of bloom, and I'll probably turn on a bit of denoising just because it really cleans up the viewport really quickly. The optics is a bit muddy, so maybe like Altus Jewel or something. Just while I'm working, so I can see everything nice and clean while I'm working away there. We'll see what optics looks like. Cleans up quicker. I guess it's kind of, if you work with it from a distance, looks fine. But now let's do the random colors. So let's do the same thing. So, you know, we can call that just color. Duplicate that, we'll call it random. We'll put this one on the material. And what we're going to do here is drop in a color user data node. So color user data, drop in that, we'll plug that in the color. And we can just unplug the other two just now. And then let's drop in a ramp. So we can drop in a ramp, just drag it in between the two, and then plug that into the color and plug that into the radius. And then in here, we're just going to grab MoGraph color. That's going to grab the attribute. And then same thing as Octane now, we can just set the gradient and create what we want. So we could go white to blue, and then back to white, and then back to another blue. And we're getting something very similar, maybe less white. Maybe we want a little bit more undersampling there as well. A little bit darker blue, I think. And probably less white. Something like that. And you've got the exact same effect. Maybe bring down that bloom a little bit. It's kind of blowing everything out. There you go. You've got very, very similar looking render in Redshift. So I hope you guys appreciate me going over this in Redshift as well. It's the first time Redshift is being used on the YouTube channel. So very happy to be bringing that here and do more of that and open up more audiences. Thanks for watching this tutorial. I do appreciate it. This has been a really fun one to make. And if you want to learn more about this and more like the PS5 one that I did specifically and getting a bit more complex with how we can get more kind of uniform art direction and just kind of changing the art direction in general, then go check out the tutorial on my Patreon. Or go check out my Patreon in general. I've got so many tutorials over there, so much value. Really appreciate if you go check it out. Really working at building a community over there and making as many tutorials as possible and figuring out as much cool stuff as possible so we can all learn and become way better artists. So thanks again for watching. Go check out the Patreon. Go check me out on Instagram, and make sure you tag me in these reels if you make any of these cool ones. And thank you as always, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.